I've been asked to speak about slavery within Islam, so I'll do a little bit of speaking about slavery in general. I want to do a very general overview, so we can always move into something deeper if there's a question. But I want to give you guys a bit of a different perspective on slavery, as opposed to the standard narrative, which just seeks to shame Western countries and seeks to hide the actual history of slavery within black countries, Islamic countries, and within other cultures outside of white people, to put it bluntly. So you guys can see my screen here. These are the public links, so let me share that with you. So Harry, I'm going to send you the just the show notes, the link where people can find the show notes. I've pasted, so everything I'm going to show will be available to everyone. So there's these two, all of these down here, everything you see here that I've just highlighted on the right of the screen. I'll be drawing from some of this, and when you have time, you guys can go through this at your leisure. Okay? And
Thank you.
right. So I'm just going to maximize this and try and zoom in a bit. Okay, guys. Slavery is a practice that has been part and parcel of every single culture in history from the beginning of recorded history. It's not something that was invented by white people. One of the most interesting memes I saw was a very interesting meme with black people love to claim that the Egyptians were black, right? That you had these noble black Egyptians, the pharaohs were actually black, and and then they also claim that white people invented slavery, but then of course you've got all the references to how the pharaohs enslaved the Jews. Right, so now you've got these black pharaohs enslaving Jews, but white people invented slavery. So, it's really, really fascinating. Okay, so where to begin? Let's start with this. Let's start about Islamic slavery in Islam. I'll start with this reference here. Right. So let's bring up some myths versus truths, and I'll cover different topics as we go. Now, since we were starting to talk about Islam, there's always the view that Islam's intolerant of enslaving human beings. There have been claims made that Muhammad was the first person to abolish slavery. This is not true. Within the Sharia, if you go into the Islamic law in texts like the Hidayah and others, you're going to find detailed discussions on slavery. Slavery was a factor of commerce within Islam. It's within the Islamic law. And slavery has not been abolished. For instance, if you look at Saudi Arabia, the UAE, slavery has been abolished in those countries in the 1960s, not the 1860s, the 1960s. And this was due to pressure from Western countries. Now, unofficially, slavery still very much exists in those countries, and slavery can never be abolished within Islam because slavery is part of the Sharia law. Muhammad was the slave owner. Muhammad captured slaves. He owned and he sold slaves. That means women slaves, black slaves, and of course, the Quran explicitly gives slave owners the freedom to sexually exploit their slaves, right? Within Islam, slavery, when you speak of sexual slaves, women that can be exploited for sexual slavery, the Quran refers to this as what your right hand possesses. These are what your right hand possess. So man can have up to 4 wives and an unlimited number of sex slaves. Now, within the Sharia, the Islamic law, as I said, slavery has never been abolished, right? And now there's an interesting story within the Islamic tradition of a pulpit from which Muhammad preached, which was built by slave labor at his directive, right? Now, of course, slavery has been a tradition of Islam for 14 centuries because slavery within Islam is the longest running slave trade in history. It's been running for 1400 years, and it's estimated to be something like 200 times larger than the Atlantic or the Western slave trade. Now let's have a look. Now, depending on which historical source you look at, there's going to be different numbers that you will find. So these numbers do vary. Many on the conservative side, but they might be many, many times larger than the conservative numbers. Starting with these, right? Over 20 million Africans have been enslaved. Now, according to some numbers, 60 to perhaps 80 million blacks were taken by Muslims and sent to Arabia as slaves. 6 out of every 10 black boys between 8 and 12 were castrated. Ask yourself why slaves were taken to the United States, right? Black slaves were taken to Canada. Now in the United States, you've got about 330 million black people. The original number of slaves that were taken to the US is estimated between 350,000 and 500,000. So that 300,000 black people who've been transported from Africa, and remember, they were bought by Americans, right? Then the colonists. They were bought. They were not hunted down by white Americans. They were hunted down by Muslim slave traders and by other African tribes, because the African tribes hated. Tribes hate tribes. There's no love lost between them. So slavery was a common practice, and they would sell off their enemies. So they were simply just bought, right? About 350 to 500,000 slaves were taken to North America. That includes Canada. And now today there are, 33 million, my bad. There are 330 million Americans, there are 33 million blacks living in the US. Whereas you've got roughly 0 blacks living in Arabia, because those slaves died under horrible conditions. They were castrated, and their children were often killed because they were not allowed to procreate. Now, the Caliph in Baghdad at the beginning of the 10th century had 7,000 black eunuchs. Eunuch means they were castrated. They had their scrotum cut off, right? And there were 4,000 whites. And now so this is in Ronald Siegel's Islam's Black Slaves, the other diaspora. Now, of course, blacks don't want to hear about the fact that Islam was a culture of slavery and still is a culture of slavery, right? Islamic slaveholders are entitled by law to have sex with the captured slave women. Notice what ISIS did to the Yazidis and other people that they captured. They made hundreds, if not thousands, of women into sex slaves, because this is legal within Islamic law, right? And now the Arab Islamic slave trade ushered in the European slave trade. So the Portuguese got their start as middlemen for Arab Islamic slavers, and they were transporting African slaves along the Atlantic coast. So they did not begin the slave trade. They were simply acting as middlemen and made money of this. Now, Arab slavery sparked one of the largest slave rebellions in history, called the Zand Rebellion. This was near Iraq, in southern Iraq, near Basra, and this happened over 15 years. Now, there were 500,000 slaves working in salt mines, right? They weren't picking cotton, they were working in salt mines, and there was a massive rebellion that was put down harshly, right? Now, interesting, Islamic slaves often avoided teaching Islam to blacks to justify enslaving them, because, this allowed them to say, they're not Muslims, it's allowed for us to enslave them. Now, the Islamic slave trade predates the Atlantic slave trade by 700 years, and it continued up until the 1960s, right? Mauritania, oddly enough, only criminalized slavery in August of 2007. I wonder if they're a Catholic country. Maybe they're all Jews. I don't know. Maybe they're Muslims. Could be majority Muslim. That might explain it. Now, Arab Islamic slavery. Now, have a look. 350 to 500,000 slaves go to North America, including Canada. Of course, how many slaves went to South America, where all those lovely brown people are, right? Well, approximately 14.5 million, right? So you're looking at 30 times more slaves went to South America than went to North America. Yet somehow nobody spends the time castigating South American brown people for their involvement in the slave trade and their use of slaves, and the fact that their number of slaves is 30 times greater. None of this happens. That is just hypocrisy, because it's not about the slavery, it's just about obviously using this as a weapon to demonize white people and to demonize Western society. And of course, Islam walks away scot-free. Now, during the 9th and 10th centuries, most slaves in the world were European. Approximately 1.5 million European slaves were taken to North Africa and Arabia by African slave traders, largely Muslim slave traders. Now, interesting, if 350,000 slaves, black slaves, were taken from Africa west to America, you've got something like 6 times more slaves were taken from Europe to Africa, and this never gets discussed. Right. This is absolutely just pushed under the carpet. No one needs to discuss that. Islam always has to walk away scot-free. Just blame the white people. And that's the standard narrative. And unfortunately, this is a very false narrative. So there has never been an abolitionary movement within Islam regarding slavery. But if you look at the abolitionary movement within the West, understand this was heavily influenced by the Christian culture, right? Britain only, I think, in approximately 2010 paid off its debts related to raising funds for the abolition of slaves. They bought slaves, they funded fleets, they made sure that they freed slaves all over the world, right? And as they did in America, they did in Britain. This has been something that is specific to, as our friend was saying, the imperfect God who wrote the Bible. Well, Islam claims that Allah Himself wrote the Quran, whereas the Bible is considered the inspired word of God written by men. But that's a longer discussion for another day. But yeah, everyone's a theological expert. So the abolition of slavery was imposed in the Islamic world by European countries, along with other political pressures that were unrelated to Islamic law. It's through pressure from the West, right, that Islam has given up slavery in the 1960s. And although documented, there's been no shaming, as in the West, or any kind of apology, right? Now, the caliphs maintained harems of hundreds. Everyone's heard of these fantastic harems of the Islamic caliphs, right? Where do you think they got those women? So actually, I'll also bring up, what I want to do is just bring up one more text. Oops. I need to bring up one more text that will be useful. So, any comments or questions for the moment? I see my camera's trying to show, but it's nothing showing in the camera bar. Any comment from you for the moment, Harry?
No, we cannot see you yet, and no comments in the meantime, and no questions. Please go ahead.
All right. I'm just looking for a term that I need. Okay, the term khurra. You'll see this here, and I'm going to find this term, and you'll find this rather interesting. Now, khurra, right? A term used in Bedouin society, this is Arab Islamic society, for the young girl who must be a virgin and white. So she must be a virgin and she must be white. Now, where would you imagine, Harry, these Arabs, these Islamic Arabs, happen to find white women?
Denmark, Iceland.
Correct, right? So they were given by the family of a murderer to a member of the injured family as compensation. In turn, the latter forgoes the right of vengeance. So, you've killed my son, what are you going to do? Okay, I'll give you a white chick. I wonder where they were getting white chicks from for this purpose, amongst others. Understand? So, this is very much part and parcel of Islamic custom. Let's go capture us some white women and give them away as compensation for something nasty. Right? Now, yeah?
Maybe you can show the map of the countries, the European countries that Islam attacked?
Yeah, no, I can get into that. Actually, yeah, that's a slightly different slide, but yeah, I can certainly, for that, I would have to go to the Crusades. Let me go, give me 1 second, I have to find, yeah, this I went through previously with you, but okay, here's a partial list of countries. Okay, so this is a partial list of countries attacked by Muslims. Okay, these are European nations that were attacked or came under Muslim occupation. So let's go through this list, just so that you guys know. Albania in the 14th century, Armenia, Austria, Belarus, Bosnia, Herzegovina, Bulgaria, Crete, Cyprus, Denmark. Remember, Crete, 654 to 961. Bulgaria, 1396 to 1878. Armenia, 640 to 645. Cyprus, Denmark, France. These guys were in France in the 600s already. And the Battle of Tours is what pushed the Arabs, the Muslims, out of France, right, in 732. Georgia, Greece, Hungary, Iceland. Muslims attacked Grindavik in Iceland on the 20th of June and the 19th of July, 1627. They attacked Ireland on the 20th of June, 1631. They've attacked Israel in all of these years, well, in all of these periods and years here. They've attacked Italy, Lithuania, Macedonia, Malta, Poland, Portugal, Romania, Russia, Sardinia, Serbia, Sicily, Spain, and the Ukraine. Now, my question to those who are Islamic apologists, when did these countries attack the the Arabian countries or attack Arabia in the 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries? The answer is they did not. Right? The answer is that they simply did not. Right? So this is just not something that happened. Okay? So there's in fact, there's numerous detailed timelines that you can, if you go to my notes, you can find this Islam and Europe invasion timeline. It's very, very detailed. You'll find very detailed notes as to just all of the places. Now, Islam attacked all of these places, and yet it claims to be a religion of peace. Albania, to my knowledge, has never attacked Arabia. Armenia, Austria, Belarus, and Crete, as to my knowledge, have never attacked Arabia. But they've gone out of their way to make sure that they've invaded or attacked all of these countries. Yes, any questions?
Anyone wants to ask a question, please? If you do, raise your hand. No? Please continue.
Okay, so I'm going to jump across different things so that you guys get a feeling, but you're welcome to read through this at your leisure. And there's an interesting story of a Dutchman, a man called Murat Reis, the Islamic pirate captain, who led slave raids. He was a Dutchman who converted to Islam. He led slave raids as far as Iceland. He was a middle-class Dutchman who converted to Islam. Right? Now, of course, you've got this interesting story here, the Irish slave trade. Now, the Irish, the majority of the early slaves of the New World were white. Okay, from 1641 to 52, over 500,000 Irish were killed by the English, and another 300,000 were sold as slaves. Ireland's population fell from about 1.5 million to 600,000 in a single decade. That is a huge loss. Okay, now people don't speak about these Irish slaves. Now, first of all, the Irish don't bitch about it. They just got on with their lives. Okay, black people, and unfortunately, I would have to that would be sort of my social grouping. They just can't stop moaning about it. Right, now, actually, if I go back in history to the 1600s, with my father's side of the family, my ancestor came into the country. One of my ancestors came to the country as a slave. So yeah. Okay, now, 107 people were stolen from the island of, June 20th, 1631. An invasion force of pirates from the Barbary coast of North Africa, with elite troops from the Turkish Ottoman Empire, attacked the village of Baltimore in Ireland. It's known as the Stolen Village of Baltimore. They abducted nearly all the villagers for sale on the slave markets. 2 men were killed in a bid to resist 230 heavily armed invaders. Right, 107 people, mostly women and children, were herded like cattle and taken to Algiers, where they were used as slaves. Only 2 or 3 were ever seen again. Right, these were English fisherfolk who had rented the port. Now, understand that these stories are rife. They've attacked Iceland, Denmark, Sweden. They've gone all of that way to go and steal white women and children. Right? So why is this not being discussed? And now I'll move to Sir David Livingstone. And I'll read you a little bit about what he says in his diaries and memoirs of Africa. This is the guy who first Westerner to discover the Victoria Falls, if I recall. So, there was a book written by David Livingstone in 1888. He was an abolitionist missionary in Central Africa, and he recorded what this process of taking slaves was like. Wherever we took a walk, human skeletons were seen in every direction. The sight of this desert, but 18 months ago, a wild people valley, now literally strewn with human bones, forced the conviction upon us that the destruction of human life in the Middle Passage, however great, constitutes but a small portion of that waste. The Middle Passage would be the slave trade from Africa across to the Americas. The Middle Passage was the passage from Africa to America, and the slaves were ill-treated and many of them died. Right? He says no matter how many died in the Middle Passage, far more were killed in the process of taking slaves. They rescued a small group of slaves. Many of the party were children about 5 years old or even less. 2 women had been shot the day before for attempting to untie their thongs in order that they might rest. 1 woman had her infant's brains knocked out because she couldn't carry both it and her load. And a man was dispatched with an axe because he had broken down with fatigue. We passed a slave woman shot or stabbed to the body lying on the path. It was said that an Arab had passed earlier that morning who had done it in anger at losing the price he had been given for her because she was unable to walk. Now what's interesting, they call these people Arabs. They don't call them Muslims. Even the historians, even academia is complicit. So they're happy to blame white people the moment anything happens. However, it's always Arabs, Moors, North Africans, never Muslims. So Islam, yes?
It says here the Middle Passage was the passage from Africa to America, so the emphasis was about American trade, it seems.
Of course, they always emphasize that. They ignore the fact that so many slaves, something like 60, as many as 60 to 80 million slaves went from Africa to Arabia. They forget that little bit. And they also forget the 14 million, 14.5 million slaves that went to South America. So they focus on that 350,000 that went to America, that's Canada and North America, and yet forget the many, many times more slaves that went to these other locations.
How convenient. Yeah.
Very convenient. Yes?
Okay. Actually, I think we have one question. Can we take it, please?
Sure.
Quickly.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think he means Sean, but I'm just going to quickly make maybe an observation more than a question, Lloyd. It's just you mentioned a lot about the infractions into Greece, and it occurs to me that the ancient Greeks were described as being blonde hair, blonde hair, blue eyes. The modern day Greeks are far from that in many cases, and it strikes me as we perhaps found some reason maybe as to at least partly why that is.
That may well be the case because certain words made it into the vocabulary, and they settled various of the Greek islands for hundreds of years before they were pushed out. And then also look at North Africa, you'll find blonde hair, blue-eyed Moroccans and even Afghans and so on, because these people inherited those European traits.
So yeah, thanks, man. Really appreciate this. Very interesting. And Sean has a hand up. Let's unmute her now.
Sure. Sean, you have a question? Okay, I'll continue until someone asks me another question. So, now, understand, jihad is not mentioned. Muslims are not mentioned. Yet these are involved. Yes?
Lloyd, there is another question. 1 second,
sure.
Please. Forgive me. Kalan, you can go ahead. Kalan?
Sorry about that. I just want to really thank Lloyd for highlighting the Irish.
Yeah, you're welcome. No, there's a lot more to be said. I just can't spend too much time on any one topic. I want to touch on various things that people can look at and research further. But yes, the Irish slave trade was horrific. It was horrific, and I mean, to their credit, the Irish just simply sucked it up and got on with their lives. And I think that's a credit to them, and also it's a disservice to them in that this trade in their lives was never made historically known. Has never been publicly discussed, and there's never been an apology, which is well deserved. However, again, everyone's focused on these black people suffered, and so fine and all, but everybody suffered. Slavery has been part of every culture. So on this point, now Livingston notes that not more than 1 in 5 slaves ever reached the masters in Cuba. Cuba's a white country, I recall, probably Jewish, I'm not sure. Okay, because apparently white people and Jews are the only people that can ever be blamed. One must never ever blame black people for the things they do, nor Muslims. Those things must always be excused or forgotten about, conveniently so. Cuba, so therefore we'll now say that Cuba is a white Jewish country. So 1 in 5 survives being taken from the village to slavery in America. That's a collateral damage of 80%. I mean, that number is open for dispute. Anything that I say here is open to some degree of interpretation or dispute, depending on which historical source you look at. Understand that. But that doesn't mean that it's not valid. It doesn't mean it can't give you a reasonable inference of what went on. We had a long discussion about the slave trade. The Arabs have told the chief that their object in capturing slaves is to get them into our possession and make them of our own religion. That's very much, I mean, he might say that. However, it's again not in their interest to convert you, and of course you are worth money to them. You're property, and you'll provide work, labor, and of course income for them. The evils we have seen, now again, they're not speaking of Islam, they ignore Islam. The evils we have seen, the skulls, the ruined villages, the numbers who perish on the way to the coast and the sea, the wholesale murders committed by the Hayu tribe, who were allies with Muslims to build up Arab villages elsewhere. So, the strangest disease I've seen in this country seems to be broken-heartedness, and it attacks free men who have been captured and made slaves. They ascribe their pain to their heart. It seems that the broken heart is the reason that they die. The Arabs would often promise a present of the villagers if they would act as a guide to some distant point. But as soon as they were far enough away from their friends, they were seized and pinned into slave sticks or yokes, from which there was no escape. So the Arabs went out of their way to capture, deceive, and enslave people. And this is how the Arabs built up their commerce. This is how they were able to build their empire on slavery, right? So, yeah, any comments before I go on?
No, it's very interesting. Please go on.
Okay, so you've got now the four founders of the schools of jurisprudence, Islamic law, and a free man is not killed. This is one of the laws in Islamic law, okay, as related to Quran 2:178. But a free man is not killed for killing a slave. And Abu Hanifa, that's from the Hanafi school of fiqh, school of Islamic law, a free man is killed for killing a slave except if the slave belongs to him. So in other words here, a man can kill a slave without punishment if the slave belongs to him, right? And there is no qisas. This would be, qisas is retribution, a law of equality, an eye for an eye. So if you kill someone's brother, they can kill your brother, for argument's sake. There's no qisas between slaves and freemen because of the lowliness of the slaves, while free men are more worthy than this, right? And the majority of Islamic scholars are in agreement that a Muslim should not be killed for killing a non-Muslim, even if he is a dhimmi, nor should a free man be killed for killing a slave. The only exception in the four Imams is Imam Abu Hanifa, but even he agrees that the master of a slave cannot be killed for killing his own slaves. And so this is from Islamic law, right? Yes?
No, I didn't say anything.
Okay.
I'm listening. Thank you.
Now, there are numerous of these rules that you'll find, nor on the master for killing his slave, nor is a free man killed for killing a slave. A man is not killed for killing his own slaves. Now, even within Islamic law, okay, this is in the Hadaya, right? This is the manual for Hanafi law, right? School of Jurisprudence. You see here that this is very much allowed. They're all regular. There's numerous references discussing that Muslim men, and this is, remember, the Sharia is eternal. It is eternal. It can never be abrogated. It can never be annulled. It is permanent till the end of time, right? So now, of course, in the Quran, you have this discussion here. They speak of slaves whom thy right hand possess, out of the prisoners of war whom Allah has assigned to thee. So, of course, you can collect booty, right, when you conduct warfare. Now, think of what's happening in England. You've got all of these towns. There's numerous of them, right? There's numerous of these towns where Islamic slave gangs or Islamic gangs, rape gangs, have been attacking people, right? Sorry, they've been taking women, young girls, underage girls, and they've been using them as sex slaves. They've been selling them as prostitutes. They've been using them for their own pleasure. And this is because these are girls that their right hand possess, because they've taken over the area, they've imposed Islamic law, and these women are women that their right hand possess, right? And this is what it means. So they have imposed Islamic law in that part of England, and this is what they do because it is in their law to do so. Now, interesting, you see here, Quran 70, 29 and 30, those who guard their chastity, their private parts from illegal sexual acts, except with their wives. So men can have sex with their wives and the women, slaves, and captives whom their right hand possess, for then they are not to be blamed. And all married women, Quran 4:24, all married women are forbidden unto you, save those captives whom your right hands possess. So sex with married slaves is permissible. In fact, in Islamic law, it states very clearly that when a woman is captured, she becomes a slave and her marriage is annulled. So her marriage becomes void at that time, and she's now a woman that your right hand possess, and she's lawful for you for sex. And marry those among you who are single, and those who are fit among your male slaves and your female slaves. Now that marry those among you who are fit among your male slaves, I don't know what that means, but I don't want to know. So, yeah. So, any comments or questions so far?
Yeah, we have a question by Johnny. 1 second.
Sure.
Johnny, please go ahead. Unmute yourself. Johnny? We can't hear you. Lloyd,
Okay, I'll
please
just
go on.
continue.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so there are numerous. Yeah.
Take
We
one.
have another. Yeah, we have another question. Sorry, Jake, please go ahead.
Sorry, a bit slow clicking the button there. My computer froze a little. Yeah, could you just give the Quran chapter verse of that one about the slaves again? So I didn't quite get it before you scrolled
Quran
down.
4:24
Oh, amazing! Thanks so much.
and Quran 70:29 and 30.
Oh yeah, thank you.
Yeah, there's numerous of them. But those are the two that I'm mentioning. Look, there's plenty. There's just so much. I can't go over everything, so I'm just going to give you a taste of everything. So, our Prophet Muhammad never approved of slavery. He once purchased the life of a slave who came to him, liberating him. Yes, and he did that. And he also happened to own about 60 slaves who were never liberated. Right? So, for instance, here's a story from Muhammad's life. Okay? Allah's apostle said, "Sell this slave to me." And he bought him for 2 black slaves. And he did not afterwards take blah, blah, blah. So Muhammad traded in slaves. He traded in black slaves. So Muhammad owned and traded African slaves. Now, he could have liberated all 3 slaves. He could have liberated all the slaves he owned. But he chose to sell slaves instead for various slaves. Right? And because Muhammad did it, it is sunnah. The Prophet said to her, "Order your slave to prepare the wood for the pulpit." So the pulpit that he used for preaching was something that was made by a slave. That's in Bukhari 47:743. Here, the links are available. Go to the links and you'll find all of these. Okay. So now here's an interesting story about female sexual slavery. Sahih Muslim 3371. Muhammad and his men take captives some excellent Arab women from a certain tribe. Now the dilemma is that they want to rape the women because they missed their wives and they also want to ransom them. So they know that their captives will be of lower value if they are pregnant. So when they ask Muhammad about doing coitus interruptus, that's pulling out before they climax, the Prophet tells them it doesn't matter how they rape the women because every soul will be born. So it says here in Sahih Muslim 83371, they took captive some excellent Arab women, and we desired them, for we were suffering from the absence of our wives. But we also desired ransom for them. So we decided to have sexual intercourse with them, but by observing azl, withdrawing before emission of semen. But we said, we are doing an act, whereas Allah's messenger is amongst us. So why not ask Muhammad, hey, can we rape these slaves? Can we sexually abuse these women we've captured? And Muhammad says, go for it, buddy. It doesn't matter if you don't do it. So here you go. Instead of Muhammad, the perfect example for all mankind and for all Muslims going, this is not good, he goes, knock yourself out, boys. Knock yourselves out. Now, it's interesting if you compare how many women is Apostle Paul said to have raped, how many women is Jesus said to have raped. Of course, if you read the works of Martin Luther will tell you that Jesus was, as he describes it, a Hurenbock, a randy goat, a man slut, a... good grief. The term it doesn't translate very well into English. A whoremonger, a whoring goat, right? That's what Martin Luther wrote about Jesus, and said that Jesus was a fornicator. But that's Martin Luther. That's a discussion for another day. That sick bastard. But yeah, so you've got Martin Luther. Certainly, you can put on a par with Muhammad maybe in that sense, but unfortunately, you don't find any example of this within the New Testament, but it certainly is the example of Muhammad and all of his loyal companions. Now, for instance, you'll just see in the biography of Muhammad, like in this case, Ibn Ishaq 734, a slave girl is given a violent beating by Muhammad's son, Ali, his stepson, or adopted son, Ali, in the presence of Muhammad, who does nothing about it. When Muhammad's favorite wife, Aisha, is accused of adultery, right? It says here, so the apostle called Buraira to ask her, and Ali got up and gave the slave girl a violent beating. Now, there's even stories about women being beaten in front of Muhammad, and he simply smiles, and he's like, okay, well, they deserved it. Okay? And of course, in Abu Dawud 1:142, you've got this hadith saying, do not beat your wife as you beat your slave girl. Don't beat them the same way, right? He said, ask her to obey you. If there's something good in her, she will do it. And do not beat your wife as you beat your slave girl. So certainly you can beat your wife and you can beat your slave girl. I'm going to switch to another document now, okay. So this is from Brill. It's the Islamic Law and Society 28. So this was printed 2021, okay. And it's called Status Distinctions and Sartorial Differences, Slavery, Sexual Ethics, and the Social Logic of Veiling in Islamic Law by Omar Anhassi or whatever, School of Divinity, University of Edinburgh. So he's obviously, you can see here, a white Jewish name, as you can see. Nothing to do with Islam at all, because as we all know, Islam has nothing to do with Islam. But let's have a look at some of the things they have to say here. They speak of these sartorial, that's in terms of what you wear, your dress. These sartorial restrictions facilitate the identification of non-Muslims so people can treat them accordingly. Those poor ones subject to humiliation and abasement. Okay, fine and well. They're speaking here of people who are dressed differently so that they can be distinguished from Muslims. So let's skip through this document without going into too much depth. Let's have a read through some of the very important stories from the traditions of Muhammad and Muhammad's followers. So, Umar bin al-Khattab, may God be pleased with him, may Allah be pleased with this man, used to strike slave women for veiling, saying, do not imitate free women. So, he used to beat slave women for wearing a veil, because then slave women were not allowed to wear a veil, because slave women had to expose themselves and often had to go topless. In fact, if you go on YouTube, if you go on Google and you look at images of Islamic slaves, sexual slaves, you'll find they are mostly topless. They're not allowed to wear anything because they must make themselves available, and normal Islamic women have to veil so that they are known and not abused. I'll continue here. Let's see. You've got this interesting story within this report here. Anas bin Malik said, Umar's slave women used to serve us with their heads uncovered, their breasts knocking together, and their ankles exposed, because Islamic women have to cover up, but the slave women had to serve with their heads uncovered and their breasts knocking together as they bent over, so that these Islamic men could enjoy the view, of course. Right? I'll continue. Umar struck a slave woman belonging to the family of Anas for wearing a veil, saying, uncover your head, do not imitate free women. And of course, Umar Khattab would not permit any slave women to go about veiled. He would say the veil is only for free women, so that they will not be harassed. By implication, if you're not a free woman, you would be harassed. And it says he struck her, saying, do not imitate free women. He used to love to go around hitting women, obviously. That was his thing. And has your master manumitted you, in other words, freed you? She answered in the negative. He asked, then why are you wearing a robe? Put it aside. In other words, expose your boobies because we want to see them. And he hit her with his switch, his stick or whip, until she complied, proclaiming, do not imitate free women ever again. In other words, expose yourself so that we can see you. Let's continue. Anas bin Malik reported the slave women of Umar used to serve us with their heads uncovered. And again, they repeat this one. And of course, Omar would, so let me see, who's he speaking about here? Okay, if slave woman, okay, he answered no, and my father, may Allah be pleased with him, saw a slave woman praying in a veil, he would hit her, he would strike her. Of course, they'll tell you with a toothbrush. Of course, toothbrushes were very, very common in 7th century Arabia. They were all over the place, including Colgate toothpaste, with the special non-fluoride variety, as any Muslim can tell you. That's why they would beat women with toothbrushes, because everybody had a toothbrush. They had a toothbrush factory in London that would fly them over to Arabia. Correct, Harry?
Correct.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty sure that the London toothbrush factory dates back to the 7th century, 6th century probably, and just the export to, because men were beating their women with toothbrushes in Arabia all the time, as Muslims love to tell us. Umar used to strike slave women and order them to uncover their heads and not imitate free women. He struck her. So yeah, lots of striking going on. I'll pause shortly on this. He used to strike slave women if he saw them wearing a waistcloth. Are you trying to imitate free women? Do not have your slave women resemble free women. May Allah be pleased with Umar. He would raise his switch against any slave woman who walked about veiled. So yeah, Allah was not pleased if slave women covered their boobies, because I guess Allah knows breast. Any comments so far? I'll put this one aside for now.
Let's see if Johnny can speak. Johnny, if you unmute yourself, you can try to talk. Or anyone else have a question, please? No?
You used the term
yes.
just a little while ago. What is a dhimmi?
Dhimmi. When Muslims capture a territory, they have the right to require that those inhabitants over whom they now have political and military control either submit to Islam and become Muslims, or they're put to death, or they can pay a retribution fee. They pay a fee. It's actually like an extortionate fee, like the mafia would force you to pay protection money. So you pay protection money, which allows you to stay in your ancestral religion, to maintain your customs at the cost of a hefty fee. So this is extortion taken from you, and that person is called a dhimmi. You are in a state of dhimmitude, a state of subjugation and humiliation, as long as you acknowledge the supremacy of Islam and you pay money to the Muslims to allow you to maintain your culture. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Right.
Yeah, it reinforces what I was assuming.
Right. So now this is the Reliance of the Traveler. This is the world's most popular, the world's most famous Islamic law manual. It's the most common one sold and available to Muslims everywhere, especially to Sunni Muslims everywhere. And of course, if anyone disagrees that it isn't, I'd like you to name the one for me that is. Okay, give me the name, give me the link so I can go look up that book, if that's the most popular, most famous, most sold, most bought, most owned one, and not this one. Right? So, Reliance of the Traveler. So if you look at section 0913 of the Reliance of the Traveler, it says, when a child or a woman is taken captive, they become slaves by the fact of capture, and the woman's previous marriage is immediately annulled. So that is Islamic law. Again, Islamic law is permanent. It can never be abrogated, never be changed. It is eternal to the end of time. And it says here, when a woman or child is taken captive, they become slaves by the fact of capture, and her marriage is immediately annulled. So let's have a look at 0914. When an adult male is taken captive, the caliph considers the interests of Islam and the Muslims and decides between the prisoner's death, his slavery, his release without paying anything, or ransoming himself in exchange for money or for a Muslim captive held by the enemy. Now it should be noted, and here's the original from the book, it should be noted that the very same applies to prisoners of war. So effectively, a dhimmi is an enemy of war, even though he's not a military combatant, because he was not part of the army, but he's part of the civilians that are captured. The same rules that apply to prisoners of war are applied to the dhimmis. Okay, so that section is done. I will now move over to the left and go up here and see what I've missed here. Okay, so Ibn Khaldun is the most famous historian in Islam, and he wrote his masterwork called Muqaddimah, a very, very well-known work called Muqaddimah. You can see here's the name. And he wrote, this is the most famous of the historians of Islam. He wrote that sub-Saharan Africans in the Arab slave trade were submissive to slavery, and he said the Negro nations are as a rule submissive to slavery, because Negroes have little that is essentially human and possess attributes that are quite similar to those of dumb animals, as we have stated. But because a Muslim said it, I guess it's okay. Now, do note that in Wikipedia, it tells you every slave brought to America was bought at a Muslim slave market. Somehow that fact always escapes. So who was capturing these slaves? Well, the Muslims were. Blacks were. Right? Now, the Barbary pirates so severely depopulated a village in Ireland through slavery and slaughter that it sat abandoned for a generation. In a 7-year period in the earliest days of the 17th century, England lost 466 ships to Muslim pirates, a figure that equated to over 5 ships per month, year over year. Between 1677 and 1680, the English were losing 3,000 people to Muslim slaves per year, highlighting a problem that had not abated for the entirety of the century. Right? So Muslim pirates raided all the way from Rome to Reykjavik. All right. So now, interestingly, people do speak of the Jews. That's a story for another day, possibly. But it does state here, and he that stealeth a man and selleth him, or if he be found in his hand, he shall surely be put to death. That is within the Bible, okay? And that would be Exodus 21. And Jewish law, or rather say the law of Moses, is very clear about this. He that stealeth a man, in other words, if you capture a man and sell him into slavery, that slave owner must be put to death. Now, within Jewish law, when people often say, well, but the Jews, if you read the Jewish, well, from the biblical text, if you read that correctly, Jews were allowed to have someone take on a contract of indentured servitude, and I believe it's for a maximum of 7 years, and then they had to be set free. Now, there were certain rules to that, and of course, but that, don't forget that also that covenant, those laws are now past, right? I don't know for a fact that, tell me, Harry, would the laws of Moses that require stoning people to death still be current in Tel Aviv? I mean, how many people have been stoned to death this week that you know of?
We stopped last week, so this week nothing.
This week nothing. Okay, so you might pick it up next week. Any beheadings in the town square in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv?
No, it's safe right now.
That's fantastic, because I can tell you beheadings and stonings to death are still happening in Pakistan, Afghanistan, and in Saudi Arabia and other places. Okay, so understand that people say, well, the Bible says, well, 3,000 years ago the Bible said that, and people have stopped doing that 2,999 years ago, whereas it's still going on today in Saudi Arabia. But of course, to mention that would be racist, I guess. So let's just blame the Jews for something from 3,000 years ago and give all of these nice Arabs a pass. Okay, so this is a longer discussion on the indentured servitude issue, which I'm not going to go into right now. But understand there's certainly a difference. And of course, it's very easy for people to misrepresent the Bible. I am not a biblical expert. I'm not an apologist. Okay, I speak about Islam, but I mean, I've learned to read. I'm from Africa, and even I learned to read. And yeah, so I'll move past this here. Okay, interestingly, I'll pass over this briefly. This was just the screen capture I took from YouTube. Old Testament slavery was not race-based forced servitude, as it is under Islam. It was a voluntary means of working off debt, okay, or keeping captives from mustering rebellion. Slave trading is condemned in the Bible, as you saw in Exodus 21, 10-20, and that was verse 16, I believe, that we had, okay, and punishable by death, right? Do note, though, that Jesus, who was a Jew, Muslims will tell you he was a Muslim, but as far as we all know, he was a Jew, came to set the captives free. Now, ultimately, it was Christians, okay, not atheists, not communists, not, I don't know, you name the crazy, not the Darwinists, okay. They did not free the slaves. They are the Christians were the ones who ultimately abolished slavery, okay. Now, this is interesting. This, as you can see, is a white Jew by the name of Thomas Sowell, okay, who says to us, more whites were brought as slaves to North Africa than blacks brought as slaves to the United States or to the 13 colonies from which it was formed. So more whites were brought as slaves to North Africa than blacks were brought to America. White slaves were still being bought and sold in the Ottoman Empire, Muslim Empire, decades after blacks were freed in the United States. That's by Thomas Sowell, right? Now, of course, any comments on that? Any questions so far? Yep.
Let's see if we have a question. Questions, guys? Please raise your hand if you do. Yeah, it's just amazing that this history remain hidden. What a bunch of hypocrites those historians are.
Right. Thomas Sowell is amazing. I mean, he's just amazing. This man's knowledge of history, of finance, just incredible. Philosophy, politics, just incredible knowledge. Okay, so. Yeah. This map shows the world's 30 million slaves lived. Now, they claim there are 60,000 in the US. How? I would not know. I mean, everyone speaks of the 13th Amendment, whatever. I don't have a clue. So, have a look here, though. Africa seems to have a lot of slavery going on because black people seem to enslave a lot of black people because black people have different moral values than do white people. Okay? Non-Christian nations tend to have different moral values, right? And do note that, man, India, I've been to India a few times. It's horrific, my God. India is just insane. Okay? Of course, in your communist countries, you don't have the same kind of moral restrictions that you would find within Western countries, right? So, of course, everyone tends to overlook and forget what's really going on in the rest of the world because they're just too happy to blame white people, right? So, now, also, this is very interesting. Just notice in the Quran, it is not for any prophet like Muhammad to have captives, to have slaves, until he hath made slaughter in the land. So Allah tells Muhammad, you, Muhammad, desire the lure of this world, and Allah desireth for you the hereafter. So, but you can't be a prophet, okay, and have captives until you first slaughtered. Now, let's talk about this. The Muslim slave trade was 200 times the size of the American slave trade. The Muslims castrated slave boys. White Christians fought to end slavery worldwide. Something like 700,000 white Americans ended up dying eventually within the American Civil War, right, North versus South, to free something like 350,000 black slaves, right? Now, here you've got white Christians fighting to end slavery, and more than double these whites died in terms of that war to kill these slaves, to my knowledge. And of course, you've got William Wilberforce in Britain. And as I said, Britain only paid off that debt in 2010, more or less, right? So Muslims have never apologized for slavery, right? They view their history as something great. This is our proud tradition. Whereas whites are like, oh my God, we've been so evil because like my ancestors hundreds of years ago, and which is ridiculous. It's just shame and guilt, which is insane. Muslims still practice slavery. Okay, now, so let's have a look at Ibn Kaim, right? Ibn Kaim is one of the major scholars of Islam, and he lived, I think, in the 14th century. So Muhammad had many male and female slaves. He used to buy and sell them, but he purchased more slaves than he sold, especially after Allah empowered him by his message, as well as after his immigration from Mecca. He once sold one black slave for 2. His name was Jacob al-Mudbir. His purchase of slaves was more than he sold. He was used to renting out and hiring many slaves, but he hired more slaves than he rented out. And that's from his book Zad al-Ma'ad, part 1, page 160. So he was a very famous Sunni Islamic jurist, philosopher, and theologian. I've covered him on some other stories on my channel, and this man is just, good grief. So, yeah. Any comments or questions before I go on?
No, please go on.
Okay, so we've already discussed this. Okay, we've already discussed this over here. I'm going to, let me just see that right, so I could, of course, go through the Hadith, and we've looked at some of those things. So I'm going to go to another section to talk about some different things. I'm going to talk about this little thing here called the Barbary Pirate Coast. Let's have a look at different traipses through history on this issue. Okay, again, everything that I've got here is available to you, right? The link takes you to all of this, and you can look through these links on the right-hand side here, right? All of these links here on the right-hand side, you can look through and you can see what this is about. So the Barbary Coast is down here, Morocco, Algiers, Tripoli, and Tunis, okay? So let's have a look. The first nation to recognize my country was Morocco, stated President Barack Hussein Muslim Obama in Cairo, Egypt, June 4th, 2009. Morocco began recognizing American colonists in 1625. And of course, how did it recognize American colonists? By kidnapping them, of course. So Governor William Bradford described the incident in the history of the Plymouth settlement. In 1625, the Pilgrims sent 2 ships to England carrying dried fish and 800 pounds of beaver skins for much needed supplies. What happened? So they were well within the England Channel, almost in sight of Plymouth, but there she was unhappily taken by a Turkish man of war, Muslims, and taken off to Morocco, where the captain and crew were made slaves. Now, by the ship taken by the Turks, all trade was dead. Muslim pirates of Morocco raided the European coast and carried away over 1 million people to the North African slave markets. So that's over 1 million. That's at least double, if not triple, right? At a minimum, what was taken from Africa to America. Again, why is this not discussed? An estimated 180 million Africans were captured and taken and sold into Muslim slavery. In 1627, Algerian Muslim pilots, led by Murat Reis the Younger, raided Iceland, and they carried 400 people into slavery. Now, this is obviously in retaliation for the fact that the Icelandic people took their little dinghies or canoes, went off to Saudi Arabia, and kidnapped Saudi Arabian women, or maybe they made war, and I have no idea. Maybe they sold them salty fish and they made them thirsty, and the Arabs in retaliation decided to go and rob 400 people from Iceland. You tell me. But I have no idea why this is not discussed. I mean, what were these Muslims doing in Iceland? One captured girl who had been made a slave concubine in Algeria was rescued by King Christian IV of Denmark. On June 20th, 1631, the village of Baltimore Island, the stolen village, was captured by Muslim pirates. Thomas Osborne Davis wrote in his poem The Sack of Baltimore, "The yell of Allah breaks above the shriek and roar. Oh, blessed Allah, the Algerine is Lord of Baltimore." So yes, you've got, and he was not a single Christian who was not weeping and was not full of sadness at the sight of so many honest maidens and so many good women abandoned to the brutality of these barbarians. Kidnapped Englishman Francis Knight wrote, "Arrived in Algiers, that city fatal to all Christians, and the butchery of mankind." Moroccan Sultan Moulay Ismail had 500 wives, mostly captured from Europe, and forced 25,000 white slaves to build his enormous palace at Meknes. Now, blacks in America who have been taught to be, indoctrinated to be, who've been poisoned to believe the worst possible thing about white people, always complain that America was built on my black. Well, Africa was built on the back of white slaves too, right? And somehow this again does not get discussed because it's okay when you do it to white people, I guess. So he killed an African slave just to try out a new hatchet, because that's what you do when you're trying out new axes. The Catholic order, the Trinitarians and Mathurans, collected arms to ransom slaves because, as everyone knows, the Catholics are evil. As any completely neutral, critical observer of history, who is an expert in all things historical and never would tell you propaganda, will give you any sort of, will tell you anything they like, that's as long as it's bad about the Catholic Church. So, yeah. Miguel Cervantes, author of Don Quixote, was ransomed from North Africa because he was captured and made a slave in 1605. So, when America became independent, it was no longer covered by the British extortion tribute payments to the Muslim pirates. So what happened was, Morocco recognized the United States in 1785 by capturing American ships and holding the sailors for ransom. Thomas Jefferson tried to free them, writing to John Jay in 1787. There's an order of priests called the Mathurans, the object of whose institution is to beg alms for the redemption of captives. They keep members always in Barbary, searching out the captives of their country, and redeem, I believe, on better terms than any other body, public or private. You may or may not have heard in history of what's called the Ransomers. These are people that would beg, these are priests that would beg for alms to try to pay off the debts by slaves to free them, and sometimes they would give themselves up. It occurred to me that the agency might be obtained for the redemption of our prisoners at Algiers. So understand, the very first war that America as a country fought was against the Muslim Barbary pirates, the Muslim slave traders. In fact, the Marines were formed specifically for the purpose of fighting the Muslims. In 1786, Thomas Jefferson wrote to William Carmichael regarding Tripoli's demand for extortion. Mr. Adams and I had a conference with a Tripoli ambassador named Abdurrahman. He asked us 30,000 guineas for a peace with his court. When Jefferson asked the Muslim ambassador what the new country of America had done to offend them, he reported to John Jay in March 28, 1786. The ambassador answered that it was founded on the laws of the Prophet. It is written in the Quran that all nations which had not acknowledged the Prophet were sinners, whom it was the right and duty of the faithful to plunder and enslave, and that every Muslim who was slain in this warfare was sure to go to paradise. He said also that the man who was the first to board a vessel had one slave over and above his share, and that when they sprang to the deck of an enemy's ship, every sailor held a dagger in each hand and a third in his mouth, which usually struck such terror into the foe that they cried out for quarter at once. Jefferson read the Quran not out of admiration or devotion, but to understand why the Muslims were attacking Americans unprovoked. So I'll leave that at that. So certain people try to talk about Jefferson's Quran as like, Jefferson also studied Islam, and no, Jefferson wanted to know what the hell was going on. Okay, so he wanted to know what the hell was going on. So yeah, so any comments or questions so far? But hopefully this is making it clear. There's a lot more to the idea of slavery than what we are typically familiar with and exposed to. Any comments?
Yeah, I have a question. You mentioned that the Muslim slavery is responsible for about 180 million black slaves
Potentially up to,
during
yeah,
the.
depends which source you look at, but yeah, those numbers are very high. Yeah.
Okay, and I have in front of me a list of different kingdoms and empires in Africa prior to the time of the colonialism, and I'm
hmm
just asking myself if they actually fought with the Muslims, trying to protect their own. Are you familiar with any kind of wars trying to protect their people from this massive slavery?
Um, not familiar, but there was a lot of death. I mean, that happened. I mean, so people were killed. So more were killed than were enslaved. So there was massive genocide. In India, there was massive warfare because the Mughals, the Muslims, enslaved. That they murdered something like 80 million Hindus because they were cat killing and enslaving, and there was massive warfare over that, and lots of people died in that process. But no, on that particular thing you mentioned, no.
Let's see. Guys, do you have any questions or comments? Please raise your hand. People are quiet tonight.
Okay,
Dave? Yeah.
Johnny wants to speak.
It's when I first started to see the true nature of this ideology, I realized that it was one of the greatest potential existential threats that we face in the West. And it's like, okay, so this has been going on all this time, and it's been hidden from us and masked, and now they're here. And it's like, okay, so how do we deal with this?
That is a very difficult question, but there needs, first of all, like there's, if, think of this way, if your beliefs were very firmly vegetarian, okay, you were a devout vegetarian, could I make you eat a, a burger? The answer is no, because you have beliefs, right? But of course, you've got people who've now lost their cultural roots. They've given up their religious beliefs for whatever reasons, right? And now you've got people who have never lost their cultural roots. They've never lost their ways. And you're up against people who have no beliefs, who have no particular beliefs. They are tolerant of everything. They want to allow everything. They believe everyone's good. They've stopped believing in evil, unless you're white, cis, white, hetero male, and then of course you're evil, or you're Catholic, and then you're evil, or you're the Pope, then you're evil. Although the current Pope is yeah, well, I don't have any good things to say about the current Pope for sure. So, um, if you find your values again, the Western values, the Christian values that made Europe what it is, then you will go back to finding the things that you defend, the things that you reject. But until you find those values, you're not going to be able to rally around a single flag, a single set of ideas, a single set of morals. Um, you know, and unfortunately, things like communism. I mean, communism is known for slaughtering people by the hundreds of millions. It's not an ideology to rally around. China employs slaves. The Russians had slaves in their gulags. So slavery is something that's part and parcel of communism, socialism, and of course, communism is the end stage of socialism. Socialism is like step one. Communism is step two, the mythical step two. Um, so yeah, I think the only thing that will is it's a religious war for them, and unless Europe and America finds its moral values. Also, here's an interesting point: is that people always say that politics is downstream from culture. You'll always hear that term. They don't tell you that culture is downstream from religion. Right? They always seem to leave out that part, that little part that culture is downstream from religion. And wokeism, okay, the idea that a guy with a penis in his underwear and a wig is a woman, that's not that's not a teaching that comes out of Christianity. That's a teaching that comes out of wokeism, communism, stupidity. So that's definitely so these ideas are growing because there's no moral values that push against it and say no. People have lost touch with logos from in all senses of that word. I'll leave it at that. Johnny had a question. Johnny had his hand up.
Johnny has left the building. I can't see him.
I tried to educate my ex-wife, who is, I think, persuaded of this socialist liberal agenda. And rather than address what I was saying to her, I ended up in the family courts, where speaking of such things would be quite dangerous.
I sympathize, man. Yeah. That's another broken system right there. Yeah, so I hope that ended without too much drama. I know how destructive that can be, and hopefully that's a closed chapter in your life and you've moved on since then. Okay, so Johnny's left the building. So let me continue with this section. I don't want to go too late tonight. I'm exhausted after this incredibly stressful trip. Good grief, flight in the age of COVID is just horrendous. Okay, so let's add a few more facts as I go down this. All right. So again, I don't want to touch on everything. I don't want to go into depth in any one specific thing, but I want to give you an overview to let you understand there's a lot more to this issue than you're aware of, and you've got information here you can look at, and you can learn much more. There's lots of areas to explore. So the United States of America had slavery for only 76 years, and this ended about 156 years ago. This number should be accurate. I think I updated it. So the US had slavery for 76 years. Islam has had slavery for 1,400 years since the dawn of Islam. So let me see, 76 years versus 1,400 years. A 1,400-year slave empire versus slavery for 76 years, ending 156 years ago, versus slavery that, according to Islamic law, can never be abolished, but was only, quote-unquote, officially abolished in the 60s. Okay, not the 1860s, the 1960s. Africa has had slavery amongst its own tribes for 3,500 years. If you take, for instance, Nelson Mandela, the great, well, let's not talk about Nelson Mandela right now.
Great criminal.
The great criminal, yes, the great incompetent. So what you have is his tribe, for instance. I think he was Zulu, Xhosa. His tribe, the Zulu. So the Xhosas, they were slave owners as well. And as one example, I believe they enslaved and utilized another tribe called the Fengu, right? So even within these tribes, but of course you can't talk about it because that's racist. Now, Africa had slavery for about 3,500 years. That's a very long history of slavery that seems to get overlooked. In America, only 1.4% of whites owned slaves. Okay, so why are we after all the whites? Now, I did make this gray here because I don't believe this statistic at all, because sometimes I look at these things and I'm like, this just smells fishy to me. Jewish households were the majority of black slave owners, and that, as far as I can tell, that's nonsense. Okay? Now, only 5% of modern whites are descendants of slave owners. Okay? So there's no reason for white people to panic and to try to virtue signal by saying, oh, we were so bad, we need to kill ourselves because we were slavers. No, in fact, you were the least prolific of slavers compared to, say, black people who were incredibly good at the slavery thing. Now, do note that 28% of free blacks owned slaves in America. 28% of free blacks owned slaves. And of course, if you go on Google, let's have a quick look at Google. Let's actually go and do this whole thing here. Okay, first black slave owner. First black slave owner. Hey, here we go. So I guess we can, let's have a look. Okay, now sorry about that. It's not gonna, it doesn't like me. So let's just go to images here. So not even the first black slave owner. So let's have a look at the very first slave owner in America. As you can see, if you look at the nose and you look at the skin, this is clearly a white Jewish guy. Hey, am I being sarcastic or am I being historically accurate?
Historically accurate, and you're not a racist.
Definitely, it's clearly a Jewish guy. Okay, it's clearly a Jewish guy. The first slave owner in America was not only a black man. He went to court and demanded his right to own slaves. In 1654, it was time for Anthony to release John Caesar, a black indentured servant. Instead, Anthony told Kaiser he was extending his time. Kaiser left and became employed by the free white man, Robert Parker, who paid the guy money. Anthony Johnson sued Robert Parker in the Northampton court in 1654. 1655, the court ruled that Anthony Johnson, this white Jewish guy, could hold John Kaiser indefinitely. The court gave judicial sanction for the blacks to own a slave of their own race. Thus, Kaiser became the first permanent slave and Johnson the first slave owner. Winning for black people. So let me see, the first American slave owner was a black guy. So, I don't know, is that covered in history? Is that liberally discussed? And do blacks ever talk about this? Did anyone know about this?
I knew about that. Can you talk a little bit about Liberia?
I don't know a great deal about Liberia. I mean, that's where where land was purchased, and then, of course, blacks were sent over there, and they completely ruined it. I don't know a great deal about it. I'm afraid I can't speak on that topic. So 28% of free blacks owned slaves, black slaves. So let me see, blacks owning black slaves. Maybe we should dig into that, and blacks should really unpack that so that they can also feel a bit of guilt. And yeah, but of course that needs to be tossed under the carpet as well. Yes.
Can I just make a small point there?
Sure.
Just that they should really make Django Unchained, I think, then under the light of that information, and just change it up a little bit, because it seems to be a bit of an anti-white crusade.
Everything's an anti-white crusade these days, man. Everything is. Oh, look, I'm not a white guy. I mean, I'm not even a Catholic. I'm not a Jew. But the thing is, I detest what I think is falsehood. And I spend the time actually doing the research and collecting the data. As you can see, I've got hundreds of pages of detailed information. And much of it is handwritten, that I collected. And yes, it's all the deconstruction of Western culture by various people that hate you. So the Islamic slave trade was responsible, and according to this number, 112 million black slaves, far more than the European slave trade. Of the total 11 to 15 million blacks shipped westward across the Atlantic, only 350,000 to 500,000 went to North America, which includes Canada. 80% of blacks shipped to the Islamic slave markets died on the way. Yeah, well, let's not talk about that, because that would be racist, or Islamophobic, or both. The American slaves could marry and have families. The Islamic slaves were castrated, and children born to slaves were killed. Now, of course, people do claim that slavery made America rich, which is not the case. Okay? So, over 1 million white Christian Europeans were abducted and enslaved by Muslims, more than black slaves by white Christians, which is very interesting. So why is that number not discussed? And the numbers are very vague, because there's a certain period in history where there wasn't good records kept. And also, for instance, in Italy for 400 years during a period, there were no women within 100 kilometers of the coast, because the pirates would come and they would strip the coasts or the coastal towns and further inland of women. Right? White Europeans fought for the abolition of slavery and are solely responsible for abolishing slavery in America and abroad. Understand? The majority of early slaves to the New World were white. From 1641 again to 1652, over 500,000 Irish were killed by the English, and 300,000 were sold as slaves. Right? Ireland lost more than half of its population because of this. Okay? Now again, this is Thomas Sowell. I've read this quote to you before, that blacks had been freed while whites were still being traded as slaves decades later by the Muslims. Okay? Now, the Irish slaves, that is something that is worth discussing again another time, but you guys are welcome to read through this at your leisure. Okay? Just this little image here. White Irish slaves were treated worse than any other race in the US. When is the last time you heard an Irishman bitching and moaning about how the world owes them a living? That's not the case. The Irish people I know just tend to get on with their life. They work hard. They move on with their lives. Black people, well, love to bitch and moan and blame someone else, anyone else but themselves. Okay? So, yeah, so there's plenty to read here about this. But again, I'm not going to go into detail at length about this. Okay? So let me see. There's a difference between indentured servitude and slavery. So I think that's plenty. This is so. Any comments or questions? Because guys, I've had a hectic couple of days. So, I mean, we can open up for some questions, and maybe I can go through some other notes here and there. But hopefully, has this given you a fresh perspective on the issue of slavery?
It's very important. I'm very happy that we have it on record, and this is something that everyone needs to know about. Extremely important.
Yeah.
Guys, do you have any questions or comments? Please raise your hand if you do.
I've got a question, Lloyd.
Yeah.
You certainly are one of the most interesting individuals I've encountered throughout the time I've been engaged. What brought you to this?
What brought me to this? Because I used to, I worked in close protection. I was a bodyguard. And I used to believe the news. I used to believe what I read. I took it on faith. And then one day, it started when I was on assignment for Bill Gates, of all people. And I saw how I was working with his media advisor, his PR specialist. And I saw how they manipulated the media. I was with them, and I started to learn how wealthy people and influential people manipulate the media. And I would read the newspaper reports afterwards. And I'd see the picture, and I would have been in the picture if they hadn't cropped me out, right? And I would read these news reports, and I think I was there when this occurred. And I don't recall this event happening this way. And I realized that what I had witnessed and what I was reading were two vastly different narratives, and I started to question. Right? I started to question. And then I started to just assume, what if the standard narrative I'm given was lacking information or edited somehow? And I just started to read. I started to do analysis and compare and try to be factual, but dig and dig. Does that answer your question? I just realized I couldn't trust the news.
Yeah. No. Okay. So yeah, that's kind of in concordance with the same kind of journey that I had.
Yeah. For instance, I used to be very well connected. I knew a lot of people back in Cape Town back in the day, and I had friends in journalism, and I had friends in newspapers, and so I was a facilitator. So people would come, and I'd work with diplomats or executives, and they'd say, "Look, I need the following done. Do you know people?" And I'd know people who worked at hotels or restaurants or whatever the case was, and try to facilitate, right, to get things done. And then they needed a journalist to publish a story, and I knew a journalist at a top newspaper that I'd studied with one time. And I contacted this guy, and I said, "Look, I have this person. They need you to do a story. They need a cameraman and a journalist. They need to come with on our little, they need to join our group. And this is for Bill Gates and for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. They're busy doing the following." And my buddy agreed, and they had an interview, and they agreed. And what happened was, in the meeting, the PR person said, "Look, basically the short version is, look, here's the story we want you to publish. Okay? If you don't want to do it our way, we'll go to your competitors. Or we can guarantee you an exclusive, and you will get a scoop on this, and you'll sell 1 billion papers tomorrow. You'll make a fortune. So you can either publish this as we give it to you, right? Or we can go somewhere else. What's it going to be?" And I saw the editor just basically just see dollar signs, and the ethics were thrown out the window, and that was it. And I realized the newspapers are so easily manipulated, it's a joke. When I spoke to my friend about it afterwards, the journalist, he's like, no, we're not like that. I was like, bogus, that's nonsense, that's utter nonsense. Obviously you can't claim that they're easily that they'll bend over, without Vaseline very easily, but that's what they did.
That's what we are experiencing every day now with the
And
COVID media.
And that kind of was an awakening for me. That was an awakening for me. And also I realized when I was with not diplomats, but when I was with very wealthy individuals, like Fortune 100 executives, and I was working with that crew, you'd find that they would very, very often end up at dinners with the president or the vice president or the speaker of the house, but very highly placed individuals. And then you'd see, let's say, a guy from a particular semiconductor firm would come into the country, or a particular mining concern would come into the country, and they'd have a dinner, and 2 months later, a mine would be sold, or a deal would be struck with a given company to exclusively use that technology, or a factory would go out of business. People would be unemployed suddenly, and a new factory would come up using the technology from this executive. And when you started to see this pattern repeat over and over, you realized that there are deals going on that and you realize that these deals are not for the favor of you, and you realize how the government's making money. And when you see government people moving from government and they just suddenly join this new company that started up, which they had a meeting with that guy a few months ago, you just start to put the pieces together. You realize there's a game going on and you're not part of it.
John, back. Maybe we can try to see if you can speak.
Okay, Johnny, you had a question earlier?
Johnny, would you like to speak? Unmute yourself. We can't hear anything. I apologize, Johnny. We cannot hear you. Okay. Do you have any final words to say to us about tonight?
There's plenty. For instance, this is a recent article. It's 2 years old. Africa now has the world's highest rate of modern-day slavery. Africa just recorded the highest rate of modern-day enslavement. As you can see, these are Africa, as you know, is a white country. Okay, Africa is a white Jewish country, and as you can see, the white Jews who control the country of Africa, because Africa is just one big country, are enslaving these poor black people. It's incredible, So excuse my sarcasm, but understand that slavery is endemic to all cultures, right? The only culture that has abolished slavery and called it sinful was Christian European culture. And of course, as European culture moves away from its Christian roots, it becomes more like the old pagan cultures of before. And as I said, even the enlightened communists, the socialists, even they had no problem with slavery. They had no problem with genocide. So, so there's plenty of information if you're willing to look, right? There is plenty that tells you that the narrative that we are told is very, very different. So there's plenty of, you can talk about Islam. So there's plenty. This article is a very long read. 735 million non-Muslim deaths under Islam. That's a very long article, but it's well worth reading and you'll learn a great deal about slavery in Islam. 1400 years of slavery in Islam. So yeah, there's lots to see. So guys, any questions? Any further last minute comments? Arthur, David, have I answered your questions?
You have, my friend. You have very much, and it's all horribly close to what I was seeing.
Any other questions? Guys, please raise your hand if you do. No, my friend, I think we are done for tonight.
Okay, no, thank you. Yeah, I'm just a tad exhausted after this this COVID thing. Man, it's, the impression that I had after getting back here with all the stress and frustration is that there's no plan, there's no coordination, or it's deliberately unplanned and uncoordinated because they want you to be unsure. They want you to be uncertain.
It's psychological warfare, Lloyd. Global psychological warfare.
Yeah. You would assume that after 2 years they have a plan. Okay, guys, so here's a problem. There's been a lockdown declared, or there's been a new outbreak declared. So at the airport, first step, we send an email to all the passengers. You go here, you go do this, you get your test, you do that. Here's an email with the cost, here's an SMS, you let the passengers know, you inform people. It's chaos. It's like they've done nothing whatsoever. There's no contingency whatsoever after 2 years to deal with these issues, which should have become quite routine by now. But it is incredibly expensive to get these tests, which takes them literally minutes to process. It's incredible. So there's a financial cost there, and the airline, it's like they're doing you a favor to put you on that plane after they've taken your money. It's incredible how easily they can turn around and tell you, sorry, buddy, you are not flying anywhere. You're not going home. Have a nice day. It is frightening. The experience I went through this weekend, it was horrific. So yeah, guys, it's not getting better. It's getting worse. And it's the level of arrogance and what looks like, it just feels rather totalitarian. It's the level of control and the level of callousness is frightening.
Yeah, the techniques, there's a Telegram channel, Reinik Fulmach from Germany, the Coronavirus Investigation Committee.
Mm-hmm.
They had a psychologist on recently, and he's describing that these are the techniques that tyrannies always use. They will send people into completely traumatized conditions and create chaos in order to frighten, herd, and then these injectables. We've talked a lot about them on this chat and other places too.
Yeah.
It's a war on our species, and they have to destroy the logos first because it's the strongest element of resistance, which inhabits the European peoples.
Right, and that's your moral values. It's always moral warfare. If you read some of the best writers on psychological and ideological warfare, on how to destroy a nation without using weapons, without using kinetic warfare, it really boils down to, demoralization literally means to remove your morals. Where are Western morals from? Christianity, right? Now some might dispute that, and that's fine, right? But demoralization doesn't just mean I feel bad. It also means we've stripped out your morals. Oh, here's a fresh set of morals, right? Ones that conflict with the ones that you had previously. So understand, it's a moral warfare. It's demoralization, which is followed by remoralization. So understand, if you don't know who you are, what you stand for, you're going to fall for anything. And
Lloyd,
yep.
you should listen to a former KGB agent by the name of Yuri Bezmenov.
I've watched everything of that dude. That guy is spot on, man.
Yeah, so that's exactly what they are doing to us.
Yeah, no, it's frightening. So yeah, it's always moral warfare. So people think that it's just information. No, it's also morals. I mean, if you look at, they're trying to normalize pedophilia, right? I mean, we all know it's happening. They're trying to normalize pedophilia. They're trying to normalize the ability to diddle 3-year-olds, right? Which is allowed in Islam. It is legal. It is fully legal in Islam to do that. Okay, which is interesting because now they want to make that normal, right? And it's immoral. I don't go against it because, the law said, no, it's immoral. My morals tell me this. And those people who want it have a different set of morals. They are utterly immoral. It's evil. So yeah, you need to find your morals again. And unfortunately, Karl Marx was not exactly, he had a beard, but that doesn't make him God.
Yeah. Lloyd, we have one question, I think. Do you still have the energy?
I see
Hello?
Paul. Yeah, sure.
Hello.
Yeah.
I see
One
Paul
second.
has his hand up as well. Yeah.
No. Johnny can finally talk. So
Okay, Johnny.
go ahead.
Hi there.
Yeah. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
I've read that at the height of the American slave trade, 80% of the slave owners were Jewish. Do you agree with that?
That's because 90% of the world population is Jewish. 90% of the population of America was Jewish as well. Because, as you know, you remember there was the Mayflower that crossed from England, which is a Jewish country, to America with Protestants, which is a Jewish religious sect. Took all these Protestants, these Protestant Jews, all the way to the east coast of America, and then they founded America as a Jewish country with all these Jews from the Mayflower. Does that make sense to you?
It does, but that's why I said that the height of the slave trade. So we're talking probably a little, from when I agree they went over there and all that, but obviously then a little bit more closer in time wise. That's when the figure
So of the 28% of the 28% of so of the 28% of Black Americans that owned slaves, how many of those were Jews?
Sorry, could you repeat that, please?
Of the 28% of Black Americans who owned slaves, right? How many of those were Jews?
I don't know, but I did read that one of the biggest slave owners was a black man, believe it or not.
No, so understand, I can simply say to you, The smelliest people in the world are curry sellers from the Sudan. I mean, it's like, oh, and if you don't like them, you're going to say, if you don't like them, you're going to say, yeah, definitely, I don't like those guys either. They're disgusting, right? And there are too few Jews in the world. Understand? It's just, so where does that number come from? It's like, well, I hate Jews too, so yeah, let's call them bad. Let's just blame everything on them. So anyway, fortunately, but as you know, the Mayflower was white Protestant Christians. So I don't know how many Jews were on the Mayflower, and I don't know how many Jews were inhabiting America and running slave plantations. I mean, we need some numbers. We need some facts.
Anyway, we are doing Jew bashing on Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. So Johnny, come back again.
Besides, I mean, for instance, I read through. There's actually a report by 2 historians. I don't have it with me right now, but I've read it. Okay, which discusses the claim that 99.7%, make up your own number, whatever. I'm exaggerating slightly there. Of all the captains who transported the slaves were Jewish sea captains. You're like, okay, so the Portuguese were the first major Western haulers of slaves. How many of them were Jews? Like probably 0. And then you have the Dutch. Then you've got the Spanish. You've got the Portuguese. You've got the who else? You got a bunch of others, and you're like, so like there were no Protestant French. It's like all Jews. It's like, are Jews known for their ability to sail ships? I don't know about that. So, but okay, fine. So understand. It just seems like it's like, oh, let's blame the Jews. Let's just make up a story, and everyone's going to go nod their head and go, yeah, the Jews.
Yeah, maybe it's a case that the fact that the connection between Jewish people and slavery is probably highlighted because they were the original slave race, and you would probably some people think, well, that's a bit harsh, isn't it? All those years, all their hundreds and hundreds of years being slaves, and yet here they are owning slaves. Maybe that's the case. That it's
I would think. Look, I mean, I would need some kind of good information, and I would think, look, the Jews are blamed for everything from eating your babies to drinking their blood, and I mean, cavities are blamed on Jews these days. I'm sure, if I check.
Yeah, I think human sacrifice and all that has been around since the day dot, and I think I'm not going to scrub any group of people out from it. To be honest with you, I'm not going to blame one particular person, but I'm certainly not going to say. I'd rather say that everyone was doing it, and that's.
I mean, look, America was a Protestant nation. America was a Protestant
not a new
nation
phenomenon
with white Christian Protestants
and things like that.
Look, no, please understand, I'm not being serious. I'm being more than a tad tongue-in-cheek with my responses. So understand, America was a Protestant white European nation. It was not Jewish. And I think the whole concept is just to say that we don't want to blame the Muslims, so let's blame the Jews. Right? I think that's a standard tactic to take the blame of Islam and to just blame the Jews by default, and everyone goes, yeah, the Jews are evil, so there we go. And I think that's all it is. I think if we look for evidence, and I mentioned it earlier that I actually showed a quote about the majority of slave owners in America were Jews. No, I don't think that's true. I don't think there's any evidence for that. I need to see some evidence, but I don't think it's true.
Okay. Last question by Paul.
Paul,
if you have a comment.
Yeah, sorry guys. I just wanted to know what the name of that Russian guy was. Woven Heart said to check out.
Yuri Bezmenov.
I missed it.
Yuri Bezmenov. Yuri. And his first name is Bezmenov. He has a different name as well, a Western name. It was his pseudonym, but
He had an incredible interview with Edward J. Griffin. You have to see it. It's really important.
Thank you for that, guys, and thank you for the.
Welcome. Yeah. So.
Cheers.
Yeah. You're welcome. Thanks. So look, I mean, there is obviously an effort to blame and smear Jews at every opportunity, but the fact is, you can see that Islam has a long history of slavery from its founder. Right. You've got a history of slavery. It's part of its religion. It's part of its law. It's part of its culture. And if you look at the biblical discussion, it's completely different set of laws and rules. And yeah, it's certainly not the basis of the Jewish economy, whereas it certainly formed a very, very important basis of Islamic economy. So yeah, I'll leave it at that. So hopefully you guys have learned something fresh and something new, and you've seen that there's plenty of reason to look well beyond the standard narrative. The standard narrative is false, is incomplete, is distorted, is biased, is incomplete, is deliberately falsified, is deliberately deceptive, and so on.
So thank you very much, Lloyd. We are going to have another event on Wednesday with William Gardner. He's going to speak about Gnosticism. Lloyd, you're welcome to join.
That might be interesting,
and, and later on this week, we will probably have another show with JJ and Christine about natural law. And that's it for now. Thank you very much, Lloyd. It's always a pleasure. I appreciate it a lot. You're a true warrior.
No, thank you. You guys are very welcome, and please forgive my sarcasm.
No.
All right, guys, take care. So till next time, I'll see you guys next week, and I'll probably catch up with you on Wednesday night. Then that'll be interesting. All right.
Okay.
Take care, guys. Bye.